A woman hurried into a house, gripping a screwdriver. Inside, she was shocked to see her family dining with a duplicate version of herself. Overwhelmed, she fled immediately. 3 weeks earlier, Jane, a physicist, returned from her morning run to find her children having breakfast and her husband preparing their meals. She greeted them warmly before showering and getting ready for work. At the lab, Jane found her colleague Reg on a tense call with Dawkins about a delay. Jane took over, assuring Dawkins they were on it and requesting an extra month to complete their work. Afterward, Jane and Reg focused on their teleportation experiment, setting up for a 6-second trial with an apple at the center and fully charged coils. Jane reminded Reg to abort at the first sign of trouble. They began at 50 petawatts, gradually increasing the power. Suddenly, a system overload occurred, and Jane quickly instructed Reg to shut it down. Later, Jane met her husband Matt at the dock, where she shared her frustration about Dawkins potentially shutting down the project and wasting 5 years of work. Matt tried to comfort her by joking about running away together. After more work at the lab, Jane returned home, suggesting takeout for dinner, but Matt mentioned her sister had brought lasagna. That evening, Jane listened to a speech about scientists. The next day, Jane and Reg prepared for another experiment, this time starting at 200 petawatts. Despite Reg's concerns about overloading the grid, they proceeded, increasing the power to 300. The machine brightened, and a wave of energy burst forth. When they checked, the apple had vanished. Reg reviewed the sensor data and confirmed it had completely disappeared. While sitting at the dock, Jane received a strained call from Matt, who confessed his love for her and their child. Alarmed, Jane asked what was wrong, but only heard his labored breathing, realizing he'd been in a car accident. Rushing to the scene, she arrived as Matt was being taken away. Later, Jane and her children scattered Matt's ashes into the river near their dock. One evening, after drinking too much, Jane passed out at the kitchen table. Her son, Jake, woke her up, and she tried to make breakfast but dropped the eggs in her daze. Ruth, a friend, advised Jane to stay busy and stick to her routine. Following the advice, Jane reviewed the experiment data, had a revelation, and called Reg. She suggested the apple might have reached the receiver, but Reg reminded her they hadn't found it in the chamber. Jane then mentioned Tegmark's multiverse theory, proposing the apple might have ended up in a parallel world. Jane and Reg discussed the possibility that their teleportation experiment had successfully sent an apple to a parallel world. Jane suggested that if their theory was correct, there might be a similar chamber and scientists in that parallel world studying the same phenomenon. They wondered why nothing had been sent back. Reg speculated that they might be using the wrong frequency. Deciding to test their theory, they transmitted their parameters across dimensions. The next day, while Jane was making breakfast for her kids, Reg urgently called her to the lab. Upon arrival, they discovered a piece of paper in the chamber with the word "Greetings" written on it. As they stood there, another object appeared. It was the apple, now with a bite taken out of it. Both were astonished and eager to learn more. Jane then brought a camera, which they decided to send through the portal. When the camera returned, the footage revealed their lab, but the person filming was Jane's parallel self. Stunned, Jane realized Tegmark's theory of parallel worlds was indeed true. Jane proposed physically crossing over to the parallel world, but Reg warned her it was too dangerous, as even a slight fluctuation in the parameters could have disastrous effects on their DNA. Later, Jane asked Ruth if she would care for her kids if anything happened to her, and Ruth reassured her that she would. The next day, Jane teleported herself to the parallel world. She went to the dock where she and Matt used to spend time and found him standing there, shocked to see her. He told her she was supposed to be dead, and Jane explained that she had come from a world where he had died instead. Jane shared that they had children in her world, and Matt, overwhelmed, asked if she could take him there. She agreed, teleporting Matt back to her world. When Reg saw Matt at the lab, he was horrified, warning Jane that she couldn't just bring people across dimensions. Back home, Jane greeted Ruth and the kids, assuring Ruth she could leave since she planned to take the kids to the movies. After Ruth left, Jane sat her children down to explain her work on teleportation and parallel worlds, revealing that she had found their father alive in another world. She then told them that their father was waiting outside in the car. They all went outside, and when Sam and Jake saw Matt, they ran to him, hugging him tightly. Jane watched with a smile. Later, they gathered in the living room, enjoying tea. Jake, curious, asked if the Sam and Jake in the other world were missing a father. Matt reassured him that they didn't exist in that world, and Jane added that in that world, she had died. The next morning, Sam and Jake had breakfast, while Matt stood in the kitchen. Jane returned from her jog, and Matt handed her a fruit shake with a smile. Later, while Jane worked on her computer, she turned around to find Matt standing silently silently behind her. Startled, she gasped. Matt remarked how beautiful and different everything was in this world. When Jane asked if he was happy, he warmly told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. That night, Jane woke up and noticed something in Matt's pocket. Curious, she inspected it. When Matt entered, she asked about it, and he explained it was a self-defense device, necessary in his violent world. The next morning, as they had breakfast, Jane's mother arrived unexpectedly. Jane and Jake greeted her at the door, trying to keep her outside, but she insisted on coming in and greeted Sam. Noticing 4 plates, she asked if they had a guest. Jake quickly explained that he had served an extra portion. Fortunately, Jane's mother left without spotting Matt. While out for a walk, Matt was approached by a man who recognized him and asked if he wasn't supposed to be dead. Assuming it was an insurance scam, the man accused Jane and Matt of fraud and attempted to blackmail Matt, demanding money to keep his silence. Without hesitation, Matt pulled out the device he had shown Jane and fired it at the man, who collapsed with a severe burn wound on his chest. When Matt returned home, Jane, worried about his absence all afternoon, asked where he had been. Matt casually claimed he was just exploring. Jane, concerned about him being seen, reminded him that his presence was hard to explain. One morning, Jane quietly approached Sam's room and found Matt standing by Sam's bedside, watching her sleep. Sensing someone behind him, Matt turned, but Jane had already moved away. Later in the kitchen, Jane asked Matt what he was doing in Sam's room. He simply replied that seeing his daughter lying there was beautiful. At the lab, Reg was busy working when Jane arrived. He asked if they should inform Dawkins, but Jane insisted they keep it quiet for now. Reg then inquired about Matt, and Jane assured him everything was fine. On her drive home, Jane noticed a police car. A man approached her and asked if she had driven on that road earlier. She confirmed she had, and he asked if she had seen anything suspicious. Meanwhile, Matt watched the news at home, hearing a report about the man he had killed, which mentioned severe burn injuries. He quickly turned off the TV when Jane walked in. She mentioned that the police had stopped her and that someone had been murdered in the park. Matt feigned shock. Later, Matt entered Sam's room while she was working on a drawing. He greeted her, then picked up the drawing she had made of him. Suddenly, he erupted, demanding to know what it was. Startled, Sam began to cry, explaining it was a school project. Jane and Jake rushed in, asking what was wrong. Matt angrily showed them the drawing, claiming it was insulting, then stormed out of the room. Jane tried to comfort Sam, reassuring her that Matt just needed more time to adjust. But Jake expressed concern, saying that Matt was acting strangely. Meanwhile, Matt paced in the bedroom, clearly agitated. Jane knocked and entered, telling Matt they needed to talk. She explained that he had frightened Sam. Matt admitted he had overreacted, and Jane suggested sending the kids to their grandmother's for a while. When she gently asked if he was happy here, Matt, feeling defensive, accused her of trying to send him back, asking if she was threatening him. Jane reassured him she would never do that. Jane took the kids to Ruth's house. While there, Matt called, hoping Sam would forgive him. He asked where Jane was, and she told him she would go to the lab after dropping the kids off. Matt asked if Reg would be there, and when Jane confirmed he would, Matt coldly remarked that Reg was more than just an assistant, before abruptly hanging up. Jane arrived at the lab and admitted to Reg that he had been right. Bringing Matt to their world was a mistake. Determined to understand what went wrong, she planned to return to Matt's world to investigate. Reg agreed to start the process, and Jane stepped into the chamber. Upon being teleported, Jane made her way to their house in Matt's world. The place was in disarray, with dirty plates piled up on the table and in the sink, and a chair knocked over on the floor. As she cautiously moved upstairs to the bedroom, she noticed someone lying under the blanket. She pulled back the cover and was horrified to find her own dead body, a gaping hole in the chest. Back in the lab, Reg was startled to see Matt suddenly appear, standing silently and staring at him. Reg asked what he was doing there, but Matt only demanded to know where Jane was. While this was happening, Jane was desperately trying to return to her world, unaware that Matt was roaming the lab. Reg warned Matt not to touch anything, but Matt suddenly unplugged the teleportation device and struck Reg, knocking him down. Then, with cold precision, Matt used his device to kill Reg. Meanwhile, Jane realized that the problem wasn't on her side. Matt had interfered. Just then, Jane was startled awake by Reg, who explained that he had driven there. When he asked if Matt had taken her phone, Jane was confused, especially when Reg unexpectedly tried to kiss her, which she stopped. Reg mentioned his work at home, and when Jane asked if he had a teleportation machine there, he confirmed it. They quickly went to his place, where Jane repaired the machine and decided to test it immediately. She teleported and Reg followed her. They stole a car and headed to Jane's house. Jane told Reg to wait outside while she went in. To her shock, she found her entire family inside, including herself, and quickly ran back out. Panicked, Jane told Reg they were in the wrong world. Back at the lab, Jane revealed the truth. Jane from Reggie's world was dead, and she had come from another world. She suspected that Matt had killed the other Jane. As a police officer began knocking on the door, Jane quickly jumped into the chamber and teleported to another world. Meanwhile, in her original world, Matt called and obtained Ruth's address. Jane rushed to Ruth's place, but the house was empty. Frantically, she called Ruth, who said they were heading to Jane's home. Seeing Matt approach the house through the window, Jane quickly hid, slipping out unnoticed and hurrying home. There, she found Ruth and the kids, urgently telling them they needed to hide. Matt soon arrived and confronted Jane, who was on the bed. She told him she knew what he had done. He coldly accused her of cheating. As he prepared to shoot her, Jake struck him from behind with a baseball bat. Together, they tied Matt up and placed him in the teleportation chamber, sending him away. Matt found himself in a dark, labyrinthine world filled with endless mazes. 2 months later, Jane and her kids, along with Ruth, finished breakfast and prepared to head out for the day. As they were about to leave, there was a knock at the door. When Jane opened it, she was stunned to see Reg standing there. He looked at her with a serious expression and told her, "You're in the wrong world." Jane's face froze in shock, her mind racing.